Imagine the wild, crashing waves of the 19th century. This was a time in America when factories were booming and the world was changing fast. But beneath the surface, the country was boiling with tension and moral conflict. In the middle of this storm, one man wrote a story that would echo for hundreds of years. It was not just a tale about hunting whales. It was a deep look at the hardest struggles of being human. This is the story of Moby Dick. Written by Herman Melville and published in 1851, this masterpiece was born from a nation falling apart. It was shaped by personal loss, a rebellious spirit, and the haunting memory of the Essex disaster. Herman Melville was once seen as a bright young writer. His early books, like Typee and Omoo, were hit adventures that took readers to far-off lands. But Moby Dick changed everything. It turned him from a simple storyteller into a philosopher. He stopped writing about escapades and started exploring the very soul of what it meant to be American. Melville wrote this during a time of extreme national stress. The streets were filled with riots over the fugitive slave law. The political air was thick with tensions surrounding the Compromise of 1850. It was in this chaotic atmosphere that Melville created his greatest work of art. At the center of the story is Captain Ahab. He is obsessed with finding Moby Dick, a massive white whale. But this whale is more than just an animal. Think of the whale as a symbol for the things we cannot understand or control. It represents fate, the overwhelming power of nature, and the destructive forces of the universe. Beneath the surface of this chase is a timeless battle. It is the struggle between human reason and total chaos, between order and rebellion. Ahab is the ultimate example of a lonely ego. He is consumed by a need for revenge and driven to madness by his own version of justice. In a strange way, Ahab acts like a mirror. He reflects a society that was cracking under the weight of its own contradictions. Then there is Starbuck. He is the moral compass of the ship. Starbuck represents the difficult tug of war between doing your job and following your conscience. Finally, there is Ishmael, our narrator. He is the observer. He is not fully committed to the madness, but he is not completely detached either. He is caught in the middle, watching a world go crazy. These three men are more than just characters. They represent different parts of the middle-class ego, trapped in a world of rising capitalism and social unrest. Yet, even as they clash, they are tied together by their fate on the ship, the Pequod. It is a reminder that no one is truly an individual without a community. While Ahab is chasing a personal grudge, the crew of the Pequod shows us something different. They represent a unity built on hard work and survival. These are the ordinary people who keep the ship moving. They are not driven by grand ideas or ambition, but by the simple need to survive and rely on one another. In Melville's eyes, these crew members are the real individuals. They are not the isolated leaders on the upper deck. They are the people living the everyday rhythm of life at sea. While Ahab descends into madness, the crew holds on to their humanity and dignity. Their strength shows a deeper truth. It tells us that meaning is not found in grand, lonely gestures, but in the experiences we share with others. Melville wrote this story while America was standing on the edge of a civil war. Moby Dick came out just a few months after Uncle Tom's Cabin, a book that sparked a fire of anti-slavery feeling across the North. The conflict was personal for Melville, too. His father-in-law, Judge Lemuel Shaw, made a ruling that forced a runaway slave to return to bondage. This decision shook the conscience of the entire country. Melville addresses these tensions through the character of Queequeg, a Polynesian harpooner. Queequeg becomes Ishmael's closest friend. Through this bond, Melville challenges the idea that some races are better than others. He uses their friendship to explore cultural differences and the power of acceptance. Modified. Even with these hints of social tension, Moby Dick stays mysterious. It does not fully judge or celebrate the unfair systems of power that existed back then. But despite its brilliance, the book was a failure when it first came out. People did not buy it, and critics did not like it. This marked the end of Herman Melville's short time as a famous writer. For nearly 100 years, his name almost disappeared from history. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, critics looked at the novel again. They found a deep well of meaning. They saw a story about the fear of existing, a critique of how money and power work, and a powerful image of how lonely a human being can feel. Today, Moby Dick is seen as one of the most important pieces of American literature. It is loved not just for its huge scale and symbols, but because it still speaks to us. It asks timeless questions about who we are, what it means to be free, and how we find truth in a world that is always changing. As we sail past the final chapter, we are left with a haunting question. What does it mean to be free in a world where fate seems to pull the strings? What happens when our search for answers leads us straight into the jaws of the unknown? In the words of Melville, woe that is madness. But perhaps, in that madness, we find the very heart of what it means to be human. After The White Whale, Melville turned his gaze inward. He mostly stopped writing about the sea. It was as if he was cutting himself free from the image he had built as the man who lived among cannibals. The confident voice from his early books vanished. In its place came something darker and more broken. He became a voice haunted by doubt, disappointment in society, and the feeling of being completely alone. The stories Melville wrote after 1851 became more sarcastic and complex. Take the novel Pierre, written in 1852. It was so intense and strange that it confused the people who first read it. Today, it feels like a writer tearing down his own myths. Some people love Pierre for its raw emotion and its fearless look at failed genius. Others hate it because it wanders off topic and ignores the reader. To the people of his time, it was not just a failure. It looked like a sign that he was losing his mind. Yet, this period of loneliness is where Melville becomes most modern. His later works, like the Encantadas, Bartleby the Scrivener, Benito Cereno, and finally Billy Budd, are full of irony and uncertainty. In Moby Dick, there was still a hope that meaning existed, even if that meaning was a monster. But in these later stories, he questions if we can even share meaning with another person. Characters speak in riddles. Their motives are hidden. Justice simply turns into silence or violence. His new ideas were driven by curiosity, but also by a sense of anger. He was not just mad at the book market that rejected him. He was angry at the very ideas of authority and identity that once seemed solid. In 1857, on April Fool's Day, he published The Confidence Man. This was a brutal joke about American optimism and the greed of capitalism. It teases the reader with puzzles that cannot be solved. It offers no anchor, no hero, and no steady voice to follow. This phase of his life was defined by big, heavy emotions like grief, rage, and despair. His early books used adventure and humor to soften the blow of his critiques. But after Moby Dick, his writing became brilliant but bitter. As his fame dropped, his debts grew. His relationship with his family suffered, and his in-laws began to notice. And by 1856, Herman Melville was a man haunted. Doubts gnawed at his sanity. Desperate, he borrowed against his wife Lizzie's inheritance and set sail on a 6-month voyage across the Mediterranean. Maybe he hoped to rediscover wonder. Maybe he just needed to escape. By then, he had already turned his back on fiction. Poetry became his new language, dense, unromantic, and heavy with themes of war, death, and the weight of right and wrong. When the Civil War tore the nation apart, he published Battle Pieces and Aspects of the War, a collection of poems that captured the raw wounds of a country at war with itself. Later, as a customs inspector in New York Harbor, a job he kept for nearly 20 years, he watched ships come and go, a silent observer of a nation rebuilding itself. All the while, he wrote poetry that almost no one read. Yet, from the shadows of obscurity emerged Billy Budd, left unfinished when he died in 1891. It wouldn't see the light of day until 1924. The story is simple but devastating. A young sailor, innocent and kind, is sentenced to hang for striking an officer. In this final work, Melville wrestles once more with the old questions: innocence and evil, law and mercy, the cost of justice. It feels like a last testament, the final thoughts of a mind that never stopped grappling with the deepest contradictions of human life. But back in 1851, none of this was even a glimmer on the horizon. When Moby Dick first hit the shelves that fall, it was met with silence. Critics ignored it. Readers overlooked it. Only Nathaniel Hawthorne, the man to whom the book was dedicated, and his wife Sophia, who called it wonderful, seemed to notice. By the time Melville passed away, Moby Dick had been out of print for years, forgotten, dismissed as a strange footnote in American literature. Then, in the 1920s, something remarkable happened. The so-called Melville revival began. Critics and writers dusted off the old novel and saw it with fresh eyes. They found in its pages a vision of the modern world: obsession, loneliness, the destruction of nature, the arrogance of empire. Suddenly, Ahab was no longer just a captain chasing a whale. He was Hitler during World War II. He was a greedy oil company in 2010. He was a power-hungry dictator in 2011. Every time a new crisis gripped the nation, Moby Dick seemed to rise again, more relevant than ever. Ahab became the face of destructive ambition. The Pequod became a miniature version of a doomed society. Moby Dick is more than a story. It holds the very DNA of America. All the hopes, the flaws, the conflicts, and the ideals that sparked the Revolution in 1775 and the Civil War in 1861. These same forces still drive the country today, pushing it forward through endless debate and struggle. This is why Moby Dick does not belong to 1851 alone. It belongs to every moment when we face the limits of what we can know, the price of our beliefs, the fragility of the communities we build. Like Queequeg's coffin, which becomes a life buoy, the novel sinks into obscurity, only to resurface at the last possible moment, saving those who are lost in the storms of ideology. What Moby Dick needed was time. It needed distance from the chaos and passions that had inspired it. Once it was free from its own era, it became timeless, a well of meaning that never runs dry. But all of that was far in the future for Melville, sitting alone at his desk, watching his reputation fade into nothing. So how do we begin to understand Moby Dick? Knowing Melville's life helps. His friendship with Hawthorne, his love for Shakespeare and Milton, his constant worries about money and his legacy. But the novel is bigger than its author. It is just as much about the works Melville read and responded to as it is about his own experiences. And here's the fascinating part. Melville had never even visited Nantucket before writing Moby Dick. This gave him the freedom to create an imagined version of the island, not a real one. A place alive with spirit, often chaotic, a perfect symbol of America's endless hunger for more. There is a touch of nostalgia in his 5-paragraph description of Nantucket in Chapter 14. By 1850, the island's golden days were already behind it. Its whaling fleets were shrinking. Its wealth was fading. But in Melville's hands, Nantucket becomes something mythic, a birthplace of daring sailors, a monument to a glory that was slipping away. The Pequod itself is like the whaling industry. It sails the world with a crew from every corner of the globe. Maybe it was Melville's travels that inspired this. Maybe it was his wide reading. Maybe it was his doubts about American exceptionalism, or simply his resistance to being boxed in. Whatever the reason, the ship becomes a floating democracy of differences. Queequeg, the Polynesian harpooner. Tashtego, the Wampanoag. Dagu, the African. Fedallah, the Parsi. This diversity isn't just a detail. It's the point. The Pequod doesn't just represent America. It represents the tangled web of empire, labor, and faith that connected the world. And then there's Ishmael. In the opening chapter, Loomings, he asks, who ain't a slave? It's a question that puts slavery, the most divisive issue of the time, front and center, even as it avoids a direct confrontation. This is classic Melville, circling the truth, implicating himself, refusing to give easy answers. Herman Melville found something rare in Ishmael, a way to live with doubt. Not the kind of doubt that paralyzes, but the kind that opens up space. While Captain Ahab rages against the silence of God, demanding answers from the universe, Ishmael does something quieter. He pays attention. He watches the sea. He listens to the crew. He records what he sees, the names of whales, the patterns of waves, the strange habits of sailors. He doesn't pretend to understand it all. He knows some things are beyond knowing. And in that surrender, he survives. Ahab wants control. He wants revenge. He wants meaning on his terms. But Ishmael? He accepts mystery as part of life. Like walking into a vast forest at night. You can't see the whole thing, but you keep moving, guided by moonlight and instinct. That's Ishmael's way. So how do you end a conversation about Moby Dick? Maybe you don't. The book doesn't offer clean endings. It swims in deep questions. What is justice? Can we ever truly know another person? Do we have free will, or are we pulled by forces we can't see? It starts with a feeling, one so familiar. Ishmael says when he feels grim about the mouth, when his soul turns damp and drizzly like a cold November day, he goes to sea. This isn't just adventure talk. It's someone running from depression, from emptiness, from the weight of being alive. And so we come back to this story again and again. The whale, the ship, the endless ocean. Because Moby Dick isn't just a novel. It's an experience. As Melville once wrote, to produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. You can't write something lasting about a flea, no matter how hard you try. But a whale? That's different. That fills the imagination. Moby Dick is massive, not just in size, but in spirit. It holds creation myths and democratic ideals. It wrestles with faith and evil. It warns us about obsession and celebrates human connection. One man chasing a whale becomes a mirror for everything. Our dreams, our limits, our need to belong. Later readers would come to see this. In Melville's time, the book was ignored, even dismissed. But decades later, artists, scholars, and thinkers returned to it. They found their own truths in its depths. During wars, during revolutions, during times of change, people turned to Moby Dick because it spoke to them. Not with answers, but with recognition. Back in 1851, while writing the final pages, Melville read Owen Chase's account of the Essex, a real whaling ship destroyed by a sperm whale. He'd first heard the story years before. Now it came back to him. The Essex disaster wasn't just history. It was personal. His grandfathers had fought in the Revolutionary War. Heroism ran in his blood, but so did loss. At the same time, he feared failure. In letters, he confessed he might die in the gutter if his work was rejected. Around him, the world felt heavy. Edgar Allan Poe had recently died, another brilliant writer unappreciated in his time. Melville saw himself in that shadow. Yet he pushed forward. Moby Dick became something wild and unpredictable. It mixed science with myth. It showed class divisions on deck. Who eats first? Who gives orders? Who gets heard? It gave voice not just to men, but to wind, water, squid, and storm. Nature wasn't just background. It was alive, watching, responding. The book refuses to pick sides. Is the whale evil? Or just a creature doing what whales do? Is Ahab mad? Or heroic? Melville lets these ideas clash without resolution. Like standing in a room where 10 people describe the same event. Each version true to them, none complete. Some see Ahab as America itself, driven, unstoppable, convinced of its mission no matter the cost. Scholars like C.L.R. James and V.G. Kiernan called him a symbol of imperial ambition, a man who believes the world must answer to him. Others look at his wooden leg, the mark of his injury, and see more than pain. Modern readings through queer and disability studies show how his body shapes his identity. His wound isn't separate from his rage. It fuels it. His brokenness becomes power, twisted, dangerous power. There's a moment in the book where Ahab nails a gold doubloon to the mast. First prize, he says, to whoever spots Moby Dick. But then, each character looks at the coin and sees something different. One sees prophecy, another sees money, another sees God. The same object. 10 meanings. That's Moby Dick in miniature, a story that changes depending on who's reading. In July 1852, Melville traveled to Nantucket. He went with his father-in-law and met Captain George Pollard, the real-life commander of the Essex. Once disgraced, forgotten by most, Pollard was still a giant to Melville. To the islanders, he was nobody. To the writer, he was unforgettable. Melville even slipped a real date into the novel, December 16, 1850, as if stitching his own life into the fiction. A bold move. a blur between truth and story. Over time, Moby Dick grew beyond its pages. People saw it during the Civil War, during the Cold War, in civil rights marches. It became a lens for understanding rebellion, pride, and the danger of the lone hero. And ecologically, it imagined a world where humans aren't on top, where whales, storms, and oceans have their own presence, their own worth. Moby Dick isn't just a wild adventure about chasing a giant white whale. It's two very different things wrapped up in one book. For author Herman Melville, it was a personal emotional release, a way to work through his own thoughts and feelings. At the same time, it was a bold, rule-breaking experiment that mixed real whaling facts, big philosophical questions, and sharp takes on the social issues of his time. All the layered symbols in the story, the great white whale itself, the gold doubloon offered as a reward, the obsessed Captain Ahab, are there to poke holes in the big stories America told itself in the 1800s. Things like manifest destiny, the idea that a single heroic individual can conquer anything, and the false belief that humans can know every secret of the universe. Even now, scholars read Moby Dick through so many different lenses: post-colonial views, queer theory, disability studies, even ecological criticism. That's why the book still feels relevant to the political and philosophical questions we're arguing about today. You might have heard someone compare Moby Dick to a beat-up old 1970s Oldsmobile with wobbly, loosey-goosey power steering. That's a perfect way to describe its structure. The book is sprawling, full of random detours, and it never follows a neat, straight line from start to finish. Famous critic Henry James actually called it a large, loose, baggy monster back in the day, and another scholar named Lawrence Buell labeled it a mega-novel. A book that refuses to stay inside one genre, mixing romance, epic poetry, stage drama, and deep philosophy all at once. All those weird sudden shifts and random tangents in the book aren't mistakes. They're just Melville letting his imagination run wild. Same way the voyage of the Pequod veers off in totally unexpected directions. One minute you're reading a super detailed chapter about whale biology, the next you're listening to a Shakespeare-style soliloquy from Ahab. Then Ishmael is rambling about what the color white really means. This messy, unstructured form is totally intentional. The entire voyage of the Pequod is a snapshot of all the crises tearing through 19th century America. Rapid industrialization, the ugly stain of slavery, growing imperial ambitions. And just like those real-world problems, the book refuses to give you a neat, tidy wrap-up. Captain Ahab is the driving force of the whole story, and most critics frame him as a mythic archetype, the kind of primal, ego-driven figure locked in an impossible fight with the white whale, which stands for everything humans can never fully understand. His quest is both deeply thoughtful and completely unhinged. On one hand, he says he wants to strike through the mask of all the shallow, material stuff most people care about, an idea pulled from thinkers like Immanuel Kant and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. On the other hand, his rage is outright psychotic, born from the deep humiliation of losing his leg to Moby Dick in an earlier encounter. Ahab refuses to see the whale as just a regular animal, just a whale, as Ishmael puts it. Instead, he turns the whale into a symbol for some hidden, cosmic truth he's convinced he can unlock if he kills it, a kind of spiritual scavenger hunt for secrets he thinks the rest of the world is too blind to see. But this pursuit eats him alive, and he drags every single crew member of the Pequod down with him, turning them all into pawns in his personal revenge plot. If you look at it through a Marxist lens, as critic F.O. Matheson did, Ahab reads like a tyrannical capitalist, exploiting the crew, who are supposed to be a model of democratic, equal workers, for his own selfish ends. It's not a simple story of oppressor versus oppressed, though. The crew members have their own desires. They form real bonds with each other. They're not just passive victims. That complicates the whole dynamic. So here's a question to chew on. Is Ahab's single-minded obsession a critique of Enlightenment-era faith in pure reason? Or is it a warning about what happens when you reject reason entirely? And what about Ishmael, who spends half the book saying he doubts everything earthly? Does his skepticism offer a better path forward? Ishmael, the narrator, is the only person who lives to tell the tale of the Pequod's doomed voyage. His survival is a little fuzzy right off the bat. He's both an exile, just like the biblical Ishmael he's named after, and a witness, someone tasked with memorializing every single person who sailed on the ship. His tone jumps around a lot. Sometimes he's chatty, rambling, open, and expansive. Other times he's quiet, subdued, like he's still carrying trauma he hasn't fully worked through, or like telling this story is his way of making sense of the horror he lived through. Unlike Ahab, Ishmael is all about pluralism. He listens to every perspective, from Pip's strange, subjective rants to the wildly diverse crew members from all over the world, without forcing one single right answer on anyone. His famous line about looking at belief and doubt with equal eye sounds a lot like a stoic acceptance of how absurd and unpredictable life can be. But Ishmael isn't just a passive bystander, either. He actually pledges to join Ahab's hunt for Moby Dick, which muddies his role as the calm, reasonable alternative to Ahab's tyranny. As scholar Jennifer Fleissner points out, Ishmael's complicity blurs the line between victim and participant. Another question to think about: does Ishmael surviving the whole thing represent hope? Or is it a hollow, Pyrrhic victory where he wins by being the only one left to grieve? And what does his storytelling do anyway? Is it an act of resistance against Ahab's madness? Or is it just his way of healing from the trauma of what he saw? The book also operates on a planetary scale, and its depiction of 19th century whaling is basically an early look at the ecological catastrophe that unregulated industrial hunting would cause. Take chapters like The Grand Armada, where Melville humanizes the whales, showing their tight family bonds, right alongside the violent, brutal industry of the Pequod's crew. Ishmael walks onto the deck of the Pequod with a quiet curiosity, his eyes scanning the endless sea as if searching for answers that lie beyond the horizon. He watches Captain Ahab, whose gaze is fixed on a single white shape lurking beneath the waves, and wonders how much of our lives are truly our own choice and how much is set in stone by forces we cannot see. Ahab speaks of his purpose as if it were a railroad track laid down long ago, saying, "The path to my fixed purpose is laid with iron rails, whereon my soul is grooved to run." This image makes us think of a train that cannot veer off its rails, no matter how hard the engineer tries. Yet Ishmael seems different. He is more willing to bend, to listen to the wind and the waves, suggesting that even in a world that feels predetermined, there is still room for personal decision. The novel hints at a clockwork universe, an idea borrowed from Descartes, where everything moves like the gears of a vast machine, following mathematical laws that leave little space for spontaneity. Still, the crew's everyday choices, Ishmael's decision to go to sea, Stubbs' jokes over dinner, Flask's steady diligence, remind us that humans still act, still react, still shape their moments, even if the larger pattern remains mysterious. These questions of fate and freedom are often wrapped in religious language. Melville grew up hearing the stern teachings of Dutch Calvinism and Puritan belief, traditions that emphasize a divine plan written before birth. Ishmael himself wrestles with the biggest question of all: is there a heaven? At the start of his tale, he feels confident that the soul lives on, but as the voyage drags on, doubt creeps in. He wonders whether death is simply an end, a complete annihilation. In a moment of dark humor, he even imagines using a ship's anchor as a bridge to climb up to the heavens, riding on the back of a whale to reach whatever lies beyond. The book itself feels like a magnificent mess, a collection of fragments that never quite settle into a neat package. It opens not with a story but with a page titled Etymology, a list of dusty old quotations about whales that seem more like a scholar's notebook than the beginning of an adventure. Melville confessed his own struggle to finish, writing, "God keep me from ever completing anything," and calling the work merely a draft, or even a draft of a draft. This sense of incompleteness mirrors the themes inside. Just as the novel refuses to be tidy, the questions it raises about destiny, belief, and meaning resist simple answers. Turning to the natural world, the whale is far more than a huge animal to be hunted. It stands as a symbol of nature's raw power, a force that can inspire both terror and awe. Its great white body becomes a blank screen onto which Ahab projects his rage and obsession, while also reminding readers of the commodity that fueled a global economy in the 19th century. The famous chapter on the whiteness of the whale shows how that color can evoke both fear and the sublime, much like standing before a glacier or a stormlit sky. These ecological hints feel surprisingly modern. The novel's detailed look at whaling reads like an early warning about humanity's impact on the oceans, a concern that echoes today's conversations about climate crisis and environmental stewardship. The Pequod's crew is a patchwork of peoples from many corners of the earth, presenting an ideal of democratic fellowship at sea. Yet the novel also shows stereotypical portrayals of black characters such as Fleece and Pip, reminding us that Melville's egalitarian vision was imperfect. His private notes reveal no clear abolitionist stance, even though the text contains subtle critiques of slavery, like the imagery of a slave ship during Ahab's rallying speech, and explores the tension between shared labor and one man's monomaniacal drive. Ahab's magnetic yet tyrannical pull reveals a fascinating ambivalence toward power. We see how a leader can inspire devotion while simultaneously imposing his will on others, a dynamic that feels relevant when we think about any charismatic figure who demands absolute loyalty. Philosophically, the book dances between opposing ideas. Ahab's singular quest resembles the lofty ideals of transcendentalists like Kant and Coleridge, who believe the material world is only a shadow of deeper truths. Yet his ultimate failure suggests the limits of such pure idealism. The narrative swings between Greek fatalism, Ahab's doom feels decreed by ancient gods, and Christian providence, exemplified by Ishmael's unexpected survival. Pip's descent into madness adds a third view, a chaotic, unknowable universe where even God's hand seems random, like a weaver losing control of the loom. Amidst these extremes, Ishmael adopts a kind of genial stoicism. He doubts the solidity of earthly things while intuiting something steadier beyond, offering a middle path between Ahab's absolutist certainty and Pip's nihilistic despair. So is Moby Dick tragic or redemptive? Ishmael's survival could be read as a hopeful sign that life persists despite darkness, or it could underscore the bleakness by showing that only a lone narrator remains to tell the tale of devastation. The novel refuses to let us pick one answer easily. Why read it today? First, Ahab's monomania mirrors modern ideological extremism, warning us of the danger when a single idea consumes a person wholly. Second, its ecological warnings about whaling anticipate our current environmental concerns, urging us to reconsider our relationship with nature. Third, Ishmael's act of storytelling after catastrophe reflects how survivors find meaning in trauma, shaping narratives to heal. Fourth, the novel's loose, experimental form anticipates postmodern techniques and hypertextuality, inviting readers to embrace ambiguity in structure as well as theme. In the end, Moby Dick holds belief and doubt in equal regard, asking us to sit with uncertainty rather than rush to resolution. As the passage notes, it regards belief and doubt with equal eye, inviting us to do the same. Modified, even the most detailed systems, like the chapter on cetology, can never truly capture everything. The world is simply too vast to map out. Then we have Ahab. He is a complex man, an antihero driven by a burning need for revenge. He hates Moby Dick, the whale that took his leg and his ship. It is important to remember that the white whale is not just a symbol or an idea. It is a real, physical creature with a crooked jaw and a humped back. Characters like Fadala and his crew from Manila are not just background actors or window dressing. They are essential to the journey that follows. The tension leading up to the final encounter is thick with anticipation. After 3 weeks of mental preparation, the action finally explodes in a sequence that feels like a deadly choreographed dance. The crew members, Tashtego, Dagu, and Queequeg, spot the beast instantly by its wrinkled brow and crooked jaw. The end comes with violence. Moby Dick grabs Ahab's boat in his jaws, revealing the bluish pearl-white color of the inside of his mouth. When we look at the philosophy, the white whale represents an excess of possibilities and things that are simply unknowable. The philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer spoke of similar ideas. Ahab's desire for conquer leads him straight toward the total conquest embodied by the whale. This is a symbol of the totality of nature, something that the American spirit constantly pits itself against. The legacy of this story is everywhere. You can see it in Steinbeck's connection to Sag Harbor and the Old Whalers Festival, which even featured a mechanical whale called Moby Dick. This shows how deeply the story has sunk into the American imagination. Melville's tale has inspired plays, films, operas, comic books, and even children's books. The story is so powerful that even people who have never read a single word know the legend of Ahab and the white whale. We see specific moments recovered in the text. Don Sebastian is curious when he hears the name Moby Dick. The young Spaniards press the sailor for the story, but he refuses, saying he cannot tell it right now. The mystery of how the whale was named stays hanging in the air. Then there is Ahab's famous speech to Starbuck. This is a pillar of the entire book. Ahab says that all visible objects are like pasteboard masks. He believes that behind every living act or deed, there is some unknown thing trying to show itself from behind the mask. Ahab sees the white whale as a wall covering a hidden truth. He believes the only way to reach it is to strike through it. Melville also describes the whale as an object of incredible beauty. He imagines the humped back sliding through the sea, surrounded by fine green foam. It moves with a gentle joy and a mighty mildness, even while moving fast. Even the god Jupiter could not surpass the white whale as it swims. But then the tone shifts from the divine back to the physical. The whale is also just a humped back that wiggles when it moves fast. It is a thing made of blubber, blood, muscle, and bone. Melville never lets us settle for just one way of seeing the beast. End.